If you're here at the beginning in the welcome, Warwick shared that today we're going to be celebrating communion, which is a very special service that reminds us of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done for us. And this service is going to be broken up into two main parts. And I must admit, if you're brand new here today, or maybe if you've never been to one of these before, the first part might seem strange because we are going to be washing one another's feet. And so I'm going to explain why we're doing that and what that is all about. And then the second part of our service is going to be a small meal that we have together. And this is going to be with the unleavened bread and the grape juice. And it's not a meal that's going to fill you up. That's what our combined lunch is for. But it's going to be a meal that has ancient symbolic significance. And it's going to be something that I hope and pray that it's going to bring us into the presence of Jesus. Now, over the last few months, we've been going through this series called The Royals. And we've been unpacking the kings of the Bible. And we've been through King Saul, King David, King Solomon, and all the other names that you see up there on the screen. And today we're going to focus in on our last and final king. And any guesses who that king might be? King Jesus. And the reason that this story really needs to end with King Jesus is because without arriving at King Jesus, the story is so unfinished and it ends really depressing and in this really dark place. And so when you follow through the story of the nation of Israel and the kings where we got up to, it eventually basically ends in destruction. Originally, God had these really high visions for this nation and had been founded with this hope of one day being this place of peace, this place where the knowledge and the love of God is felt and is shining like a bright light in the nation and also to the world around it. It was like it was supposed to be this little piece of heaven on earth. And all of these kings that you see here, their task was to really lead the nation towards that vision. But how well did they do? As we've seen, the history of those kings was a history of violence and of walking away from God, and even the best of kings only brought in the short reign of peace, and even those situations had a lot that was left to be desired. And so eventually, God's presence and protective presence is removed, and the Assyrians come through and wipe out the north, and then what is left, the Babylonians finish up, and God's people are taken prisoners and led off as captives into exile. And we're kind of left in this dark place. But the thing I love about this story is that no matter how dark the places we find ourselves in, with God there is always hope. With God there is always something to look forward to. And so in the midst of this dark place that they found themselves in, God gives them this promise. And this promise came in lots of different forms, but here's one of my favorite versions of this promise. And it says this: "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." So here's this promise that one day there will be another child that will be born who will be king. And the leadership of the nation will rest now upon his shoulders. And just take a moment to sort of absorb the grandeur of these titles that this king is given. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And this would not just be a temporary reign of things going well, but this would be an eternal reign. There will be no end. This will be an eternal reign of peace and righteousness and justice. This king would bring in that vision that God had set for his people and for us. And so the people, this hope, this nation is almost extinguished, but they hold on to this hope and they wait and they wait and they wait for 700 years until eventually a child is born and his name is Jesus. But the thing is about Jesus, when Jesus turned up, a lot of people didn't recognize him. Even though they'd been waiting for this coming king, they missed him because he didn't look like the kings that they were used to seeing. Jesus didn't walk around in fancy clothes. He didn't live in a luxurious palace. He didn't have these treasuries filled with gold and silver. He didn't have that sort of greatness. But that's kind of the point. For Jesus, he was great, but for Jesus, he defined greatness in a very different way. I want to read to you a way that Jesus himself defines the type of greatness that would be at the heart of this kingdom that he was establishing. Now, just before Jesus says this, his disciples are trying to scheme up some ways to be higher up amongst the other disciples. But Jesus says this. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." For Jesus, the greatness is defined not in what we can get, but in what we can give. For Jesus, greatness is defined not in being surrounded by people that are serving us, but in being the servant. For Jesus, greatness is defined through acts of selfless love and of humble humility. And so because Jesus was all about this, and because his kingdom would be all about this, and because he didn't want us to forget it, he asked us to wash one another's feet. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think washing feet is the most enjoyable thing. It's not. I didn't wake up this morning and go, "Yes, I get to wash feet." But I think that's kind of the point. We don't wash feet because we just love washing feet so much, but it's an act of service. And now, we've all come here, presumably, probably had a shower this morning, and we're coming with clean feet. And so we're washing feet not to really necessarily get those feet clean, but to remind us of the type of person that Jesus was, and to remind us of the example that he has left us to emulate in our own lives. And so I want you just to take you to that scene there. Jesus is with his disciples. It's the last meal he would have with them before he dies. And they're sitting in there. They're about to have this meal. But even though the disciples had been very careful in preparing everything perfectly, they'd made a mistake. They had forgot to organize someone to wash the feet. And in those days, it was custom to do this because they walked around with sandals. And even if they had a bath before they came there, their feet would be dirty. And that was uncomfortable. And so they would usually have someone. And the other thing with the custom is it wasn't the most important person in the room who would wash those feet, but rather it was the person right at the bottom of that social hierarchy who would have that task. And so once again, the disciples, they're fighting amongst themselves. Who's the greatest? Who's going to be the biggest? And who's going to be the best in this kingdom? And yet there's at the same time this awkward thing going on where there's no one to wash the feet. But no one wants to admit that they are at the bottom of the social hierarchy. So in this scene, Jesus stands up and he picks up a towel and wraps it around his waist. And to their surprise and shock, he begins to wash their feet one by one. And when he gets to the end of that, washing those feet, he says, "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." And so we're now going to wash one another's feet, not because they're dirty, but to remind us of the type of person Jesus was, someone who found greatness not in being served, but in being the servant, and to remind us of that example to live that out in our own lives as well. And so when Jesus was killed upon the cross, the crime that he was charged with was, interesting enough, being a king. And the religious Jewish leaders, they could have brought lots of things against Jesus. There was lots of things they didn't like about Jesus, but the thing they chose to accuse him before the Romans was being a king, claiming to be a king, because they knew that that was the quickest way to get yourself killed in the Roman Empire. And so this theme of Jesus being a king, or the King of the Jews, is a theme that runs right through the story of the crucifixion. We first see it when Jesus is before Pilate, and Pilate says, "Are you the King of the Jews?" To which Jesus says, "You have said so." And then when Jesus is taken into that, before the soldiers, and they abuse him and they mock him, they mock him as a king. They put that robe around his neck. They put that crown of thorns on their head, and they give him that scepter, and they bow down before him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then when Jesus is finally crucified upon the cross, the charge written above his head is, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." And the soldiers beneath him walk around saying this. The soldiers also came and mocked him and said, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." Now, there's a lot of true things about that statement. Firstly, yes, Jesus was the King of the Jews. He was also King of the Romans. He's also King of the universe. And yes, because he was that king, he did have the power to save himself. But the thing is, he could not both save himself and save all of us as well. It's interesting that the previous night, when Jesus was being arrested, one of his disciples, Peter, he pulls out a sword and tries to fight on behalf of Jesus. And Jesus says, "Stop, Peter, what are you doing? Don't you realize that if I said a single word, 12 legions, 12 armies of angels could come immediately to my rescue?" So Jesus is on the cross with that power. He wasn't the first person to be crucified. He wouldn't be the last person to be crucified. But he was the only person to be crucified who, with a single word, could have stopped it all. But he made a choice. Will I save myself, or will I save everyone else? And the thing I love about Jesus is that in that moment he chose to save us. He said, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." That's the love that Jesus has for us. That when the option came between saving yourself or to saving you and me, Jesus said, "I choose to save Jared. I choose to save Reese. I choose to save Ewan." That's the incredible loving God that we have. And so I want to take you back to that final meal that Jesus had with his disciples. And Jesus is there. He's washed everyone's feet, and now his mind is turned to the greater act of service that would soon take place, his death upon the cross. And he picks up that unleavened bread, and he sees what's going to happen to him in that bread. And as it is broken, he knows that soon his body would be broken. And then as he picks up the cup with the juice, grape juice in it, and it is poured out of that cup, he sees what's going to happen to him. His blood would be spilled. But he was still willing to do it because he loves us so much. And he would rather save all of us than to save himself. And so Jesus says that while they were eating, Jesus took the bread, and when he'd given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body. The greatest gift I can give to you is myself, and that is what I am doing." And then he took a cup, and when he'd given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." And so in the same way, Jesus is saying to them, this great act of sacrifice, it's for you. It's up to you now to take and receive it.